You know, they always say your home is your castle, but they forget to mention that sometimes there's a self-appointed king living next door who thinks he owns your moat, your drawbridge, and even the air you breathe. I've lived in Oak Creek Heights for nearly a decade, and for most of that time, I played by the rules, kept my lawn at exactly 3 inches, and nodded politely at the HOA board meetings. But everything changed the year my father, Elias, moved in with me after a nasty fall on the ice that nearly cost him his mobility. Watching a man who spent 40 years as a high-rise ironworker look at a patch of frozen sidewalk with genuine terror in his eyes, well, it does something to you. It shifts your priorities in a way that no neighborhood handbook can ever touch. So, I did what any son would do. I spent $15,000 of my hard-earned savings to install a state-of-the-art hydronic radiant heating system under my driveway and front walkway, using these beautiful charcoal gray pavers that stayed bone dry no matter how hard the sleet came down. It wasn't an oppose, tease about showing off. It was about the fact that my dad could walk to the mailbox in December without feeling like he was navigating a minefield. And for a while, it was perfect, a little slice of safety in a brutal Ohio winter. But the thing about Oak Creek Heights is that we had a man named Arthur Sterling running the HOA, a guy who looked like he was carved out of old library paste and dressed exclusively in sweaters that cost more than my first car, and Arthur didn't oppose. TC, his son, taking care of his father, he saw a, end quote, violation of visual uniformity, end quote. The first letter was almost laughable, a polite little nudge about how my walkway was, end quote, distractingly clear, end quote, during light flurries, which apparently ruined the, end quote, cohesive winter aesthetic, end quote, of the street, but I ignored it, thinking surely a grown man had better things to do than complain about a lack of ice. But then came the great freeze of mid-January, a storm the meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-generation event, with winds that sounded like a freight train screaming through the pines and snow piling up so fast the city plows just gave up and went home. My walkway was a miracle, a dry, steaming ribbon of safety in a world of white chaos. And I spent that Tuesday helping my neighbor, Sarah, get her oxygen tanks from the delivery truck and making sure the elderly couple across the street had a clear path to my door in case their power went out. I was standing in my kitchen, pouring a mug of coffee for my dad, when I saw a figure struggling through the drifts. It was Arthur, wrapped in a parka that looked like it belonged on an Everest expedition, clutching a plastic sleeve folder like it was the Holy Grail. He didn't oppose. T-knock, he didn't oppose. T-check to see if we were okay in the sub-zero temps. He just taped a neon orange notice to my front glass and vanished back into the whiteout like some kind of suburban wraith. I opened the door, the wind nearly ripping the hinges off, and read the words that made my blood turn to liquid fire. Immediate cease and desist. Unauthorized utility modification, creating an unfair environmental advantage. Penalty, $500 per day, retroactive to the start of the storm, until the system is physically dismantled. An, end quote, unfair environmental advantage, end quote. Can you believe the ego on this guy? He wanted me to turn off the heat and let my father's only path to safety freeze over in the middle of a literal disaster. All because he couldn't oppose. T-stand that I'd solved a problem he preferred to use as a leash. I was ready to storm over there and settle it with my fists, but my dad just laid a hand on my arm, his voice quiet but steady, telling me that men like Arthur don't break when you hit them. They only break when you unmask them. I went down to the basement, my heart hammering against my ribs, intending to just flip the breaker and fight the legal battle later. But as I reached for the panel, I noticed something I'd never seen before, a strange, low-frequency hum vibrating through the concrete floor near the back storage room. I'd lived here 10 years and never poked around behind the heavy steel shelving I'd inherited from the previous owner. But today, fueled by a mixture of spite and adrenaline, I shoved the racks aside and found a heavy-duty access plate bolted into the foundation. It wasn't an oppose, T on any blueprint I'd ever seen, so I grabbed my toolkit, pried the rusted bolts loose, and felt a rush of damp, metallic air hit my face as I stared down into a hidden crawl space that didn't oppose, T officially exist. I crawled in with a flashlight, my breath misting in the dark, and followed a series of massive, high-pressure PVC pipes that were bypass wired directly into the neighborhood's main junction, but they weren't into oppos. Carrying city water, they were pulsing with a rhythm that suggested a massive, industrial-grade pump somewhere deep underground. I spent the next 6 hours, while the storm raged above, digging through the old county surveyor records I'd downloaded months ago for my renovation, cross-referencing GPS coordinates and utility easements until my eyes burned. And that's when the world stopped spinning for a second. I realized that Oak Creek Heights wasn't into oppos. Connected to the municipal water grid at all, despite the fact that every single one of us had been paying, in quote, city utility fees, in quote, to the HOA for a decade. Arthur and his hand-picked board had been running a massive, illegal subterranean well system located on a, in quote, protected nature preserve, in quote, behind the clubhouse, bypassing every EPA regulation, every safety test, and every tax code in the book. They were charging us premium rates for raw, untreated groundwater and pocketing the difference, a slush fund that likely totaled in the millions, all while we drank, bathed, and cooked with water that had never seen a drop of chlorine or a single inspector's clipboard. The next morning, the sun came out, reflecting off the snow with a blinding, deceptive peace, and right on cue, Arthur's Mercedes SUV came crawling down the street, stopping in front of my house so he could take a photo of my still-clear walkway for his, in quote, evidence, in quote, folder. I didn't into oppos. Wait for him to get out. I walked down that dry, heated path in my slippers, holding a manila envelope and a steaming cup of coffee, and I waited for him to lower his window with that smug, in quote, I've got you now, in quote, smirk. He started to say something about the fines, about how the board was meeting at noon to discuss my, in quote, eviction level violations, in quote, but I just leaned against his door and told him, in quote, Arthur, I'm curious. Does the EPA know about the arsenic levels in the North Well, or should I let the FBI explain it to them when they arrive for the 10 a.m. tour of your basement? End quote. I've never seen a human being turn the color of a spoiled cauliflower so fast. He tried to bluster, tried to claim I was delusional, but when I pulled out the photos of the bypass junction and the printed ledger of the diverted funds I'd found in the digital archives of the previous board treasurer, his hand started to shake so hard he dropped his iPad. I didn't oppose. Stopped there. I'd already sent the files to the state health department and a friend of mine who writes for the city's biggest investigative blog, and by noon, the, in quote, aesthetic consistency, in quote, of our neighborhood was replaced by the flashing blue lights of state police cruisers and environmental hazard teams. They found out the water we'd been drinking for years was hovering just below the legal limit for heavy metal contamination. A secret Arthur had been hiding by faking the annual reports and bribing a local lab technician with the money he'd stolen from our, in quote, beautification fund, end quote. The fallout was nuclear. The HOA was dissolved by a court order within a month. Arthur is currently serving a 7-year sentence for racketeering and public health endangerment, and the new, resident-led. Council's first act was to pass a, in quote, safety first, in quote, amendment that actually encourages things like heated walkways and solar lighting. But the weirdest part ISN and oppos, the money or the lawsuits, it's the way the street feels now. Because for the first time in 10 years, people actually talk to each other without looking over their shoulders to see if a board member is taking notes. My dad sits on the porch now, even in the cold, watching the kids from 3 houses down use our dry walkway as a, in quote, safe zone, in quote, for their snowball fights. And he just smiles, knowing that sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to look beneath the surface and find where the rot started. It makes me wonder, though, how many of you living in these, in quote, perfect, in quote, gated communities or managed neighborhoods actually know what's happening under your feet or what your, in quote, dues, in quote, are really paying for? Have you ever noticed something in your neighborhood that felt just a little too, in quote, controlled, in quote, or have you ever had to choose between following a ridicule, us rule, and doing what was actually right for your family? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Because trust me, the truth is usually a lot messier than the brochure leads you to believe.